16 million colors wreak some havoc in your head.
SEGA Saturn.
Alright everybody, welcome to this week's episode of TitanCast. As you'll remember, if you caught the last little podcast, we had a little discussion about our personal stories, our history with the system, how the community has brought us back from the brink, the birth or rebirth rather of the Saturn junkyard. And we figured this week we go in a little more detail about some things, and seeing how the Facebook page has garnered a huge number of new members. I mean, we've almost quadrupled in size over the span of a month. We figured we'd kind of delve into some of the beginning or baby steps rather that are the SEGA Saturn, and try to get some of y'all people who may have never had really any experience with the system back up to speed and get y'all on the flight line with the rest of us veterans. So with that, I also need to let everybody in on a little secret. Our Lord and Savior, Father K, wasn't able to be present with us this week. He actually had a number of things going on with his family and friends, and he kind of figured that it'd be best to keep the wife happy this time. So we greatly appreciate his services, and we're going to keep rolling without him this week. So much love to Father K, everybody. All right, y'all. Let's see what we got going on today. Besides all the ranter and the introductions, etc., our buddy old Virtual Schlub, he came up with a topic back up on the Saturn junkyard a couple of weeks back. It was basically an introduction, a newbie's guide to the SEGA Saturn. And I'm gonna kind of hand it over to Brian and let him give you a little bit of idea of what he had going down.
So I mean, really, over the last couple of weeks or so, I recently broke my leg around Halloween. So I've had quite a bit of free time over on my hands. I thought about just going through and seeing what kinds of content like this might be helpful for a lot of the new members, as you were mentioning. I mean, we're at like 400 people now, which is insane, at least as of today. And so I think it makes sense that a lot of those people will probably be pretty new to the system. And I think it would behoove us to take a step back and kind of go through a few talking points about, what you can expect as new, or even if you've owned the Saturn for a while. I think it might help to go through an overview, just a little bit of the bullet points for the history and strengths and weaknesses of the console. A little bit about how to hook up your console and how to get a decent output for your video in 2017. Some of the benefits of having accessories like action replay and that kind of stuff that'll help make your time collecting for the Saturn a lot easier. And certainly some of the benefits of importing and opening up to the Japanese library for the system, and other just odds and ends and tips and tricks we can think of that might to just help get you a little more mileage out of what the Saturn's all about.
Yeah, man. First off, I figured out that, or at least I figured we could kind of talk about, like you said, the history of the system. And last week we had, personal stories and everything. We kind of described, the transition from the Sega Genesis Mega Drive to the Saturn, the eventual fall of the Saturn, and then the rise of the Dreamcast and the eventual fall of the Dreamcast. Now, a lot of people, myself included, I grew up in the mid 2000s thinking that the Sega Saturn was just completely demolished by the PlayStation. And truth be told, I mean, if you really look at the facts, kind of like what I spoke about last week, the, technically, the system outperformed Sony's PlayStation over and over and over from a technical hardware aspect. There was a number of issues with it. It had a dual processor. You had quadrangles instead of triangles. There was so many different things going on. On top of that, it was extremely hard to create transparencies for a lot of people, so a lot of people used dithering. There was so many different aspects from a 3D point of view that put the system at a disadvantage. But like a lot of us know, at least in the Sega Saturn community, the beast is ridiculous. ridiculous whenever it comes to 2D. Whenever it comes to 2D, it is a monster. It can demolish everything that you put in its wake. I mean, it truly was a 64-bit system to rule all 64-bit systems, at least in regards to the 2D dynamic. I mean, one of the only few exceptions might be everybody's going to talk about, Castlevania on the PlayStation. But the truth be told is that Konami did a piss poor port over to the Sega Saturn. I mean, there was no real love put into the system.
Yeah. Yeah, and that seemed like a pretty common. I mean, I don't know if there was just a patience issue or if developers felt it was just too expensive to put that much personnel into a project to try to really get the most out of the Saturn's complicated hardware, at least relative to the PlayStation. And so, yeah, I mean, there were unfortunately just far too many instances where you get these kind of half-ass ports that didn't really hold up technically. Even if the the innards of the console theoretically could have with a little more time and dedication to that development cycle could have gotten some pretty good results out of some of those games that ended up underperforming.
Right. I mean, for me at least, whenever I looked at the system way back when, I mean, you got to think about it like this: the Sega Saturn was only in relevance, at least here in the Western markets, for approximately 3, maybe 4 years if you're
Mhm.
really pushing it. Okay, whereas the Japanese were still pumping out games for it all the way until 2000, 2001, I believe. And we
Yeah.
spoke about this, and this is going to allude later on to the episode. I mean, there's over 1,000 Sega Saturn games. A lot of them are exclusive to Japan. A number of the admins and administrators over at the junkyard will tell you about Sexy Paradise and the Puyo Puyos and all these. And I mean, games that never made it stateside, never made it to PAL regions.
Yeah.
They're exclusive. They're never coming over here. Um, there have been fan translations of some things, like you've got the what is it?
Yeah, I mean, you had like Dragon Force 2 and the scenarios 2 and 3 of the Shining Force 3 and some of those Police Knots.
Right, right. I mean, you had some awesome, just absolutely awesome games that took a while to get over here, and it was only because of the fans that it happened. So, I mean, you've got a massive library to look at. So, the Sega Saturn was not a failure, at least not in regards to the games. It was a commercial failure.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it sold about 9.25 million worldwide. And as you were saying, yeah, I mean, in Japan, it was by far the most successful. So, looking back on it today, when you're kind of looking to see where should we, where should you focus your efforts on collecting? I mean, I've found um, almost in many instances, almost every instance, a game that ended up having really low print runs and was really rare in PAL and North America territories. You can get for a lot cheaper by going for the Japanese version. I mean, whether it's like Saturn Bomberman or House of the Dead 2 or House of the Dead 1, I'm sorry, and then a few other, quite a few other games, all the Panzer Dragoon games. I think there's just a lot of benefits to owning a Saturn and being able to open yourself up to that Japanese side of things for sure.
Yeah, and if you're going to talk about going into the Japanese market, of course, we got to talk about the ability to play Japanese games. One of the easiest routes to go, a lot of people do it all the time, is they get an action replay. They are 1 megabyte, 4 megabyte, also have external memory capabilities, and they act as a game genie, and they
Mhm.
also have the ability to bypass regions. So you have multiple things inside of this little box that can absolutely open up your library, not only to the Japanese market, but there's also European and NTSC North American, you know, exclusives.
Mhm.
That there are a number of games that are exclusive to the PAL region, like Deep Fear, with its English text and its English dialogue that were never seen over here in America. Now, granted, there's been fan patches that have dropped it over to 60 hertz instead of the 50 hertz it's originated in, but at the same time, it's very expensive to buy a PAL copy of that. It's a lot cheaper to buy the Japanese copy and get a walkthrough. So there's pros and cons to the action replay, at least whenever it comes to legitimate commercial disc. There's also the possibility that a lot of people use is they'll just import Japanese Well, very rarely will you see people import PAL region consoles, but a lot of people will actually import Japanese consoles.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you can understate it enough. I mean, that action replay, I think, is one of the first and foremost things you should buy or accessories you should get with a Saturn if you're if you're a newcomer to the system. And even for me, I have one that's unmodded, and I love it just for all of the save uh, backup storage it offers as well. So I can just keep pretty much all of my game saves in one place and not really have to worry about it too much. Although at the rate things are growing, I may need to get a couple more to to supplement it.
Right, and there's one caveat I do want to express right now, and that is the fact that if you do not understand this, I cannot express it enough. Whenever you're utilizing third party apparatus, third party cartridges, whatever it might be, whenever it comes to that RAM ROM expansion port, anything that is third party, do not pull it out and put it back in multiple times a day over the
Yeah.
course of its life.
Yep.
Those pins that basically the diameter of the actual slot is smaller than what the third party pins are going to be. Um, More than likely, not 100% of the time, but more than likely, going in and out like that, you have the possibility of breaking connections inside the RAM expansion port. You also have the ability of expanding it to the point to where no connection can be had. We've had a number of members on the junkyard who have reported issues where utilizing first party apparatus like specific ROM carts and specific RAM carts from Sega, they don't work because of the fact that there's ports on their Saturns. They're not the spec anymore. They've been moved out of place, legs have been broken, things aren't right anymore. So that's one thing we have to stress.
Yeah, that exact thing happened to me when I bought my Saturn or my first Saturn. Like it was in an eBay lot a long time ago. It came with, and I think it was an Interact memory card. I'm not certain on the top of my head, but that thing was just, yeah, it was a little too tight for those pins, and you can tell the previous owner. By the time I got to it, and I pretty much took that shit out immediately and put in a normal size cart. The damage was already done. It didn't really matter because that Interact card pretty much messed up that port, and it's such a frail part of the hardware that, yeah, I mean, I feel like this is a really common issue. I mean, it's got to be something that pretty much anybody who owned those third party, or at least the incorrect third party parts or carts, had to deal with.
That there are you can resolve the issue with these things at times. I mean, just because it's messed up right now doesn't mean
Mhm.
it's going to be messed up forever. There are ways to fix it. Um, However, if you're wanting to go a different route, we've talked about modifications before, and later on down the line, we're going to have an entire episode dedicated to what you can actually do to the Saturn to expand your gaming library, expand your gaming experience. But if you don't want to go through the hassle of possibly messing up your RAM expansion port, you don't want to go through the hassle of importing, consoles from halfway across the world that you don't know if they're going to work, you could always look at the modifications in the sense of there are switchless region mods, there are switched region mods, there are 50, 60 hertz mods, there's numerous mods, and most of these mods don't actually, the chips themselves, the switches, they don't cost a lot of money. I mean, you're talking generally speaking $15, $20 to get everything going on. If you yourself have the ability to do it, you have no labor cost. Otherwise, most of the time, most modders are going to, I know myself, I normally charge people about $30 to do a job, regardless of what job it is, because sometimes you'll have problems pop up. Sometimes you'll have to reorder stuff. So kind of keep that in mind. If you do it yourself to go completely region free, complete region BIOS, skip the action replay, just stick with Sega Saturn, Sega first party exclusive RAM expansion, also memory, all that, you're probably
Mhm.
looking at about $10 to $15 on your own, probably about 40 if you get somebody else to do it. So that is one possibility if you're one of the people who are really worried about messing up your Saturn.
Yeah, that's good to know. I mean, I feel like I need to I need to take like a soldering 101 class or something because apart from fixing random things here and there just out of curiosity, yeah, that's definitely a concern. I'm always worried I'll just mess crap up. Yeah, and so I think the other aspect that we wanted to get into here, granted, it's 22 years after the fact, so the way that we display our game consoles these days have drastically changed from back in the mid 90s. And so, I think for the most part, there have been a lot of good options for adapting to that. And I think it makes sense to just go through really what you and I have been doing and what we'd recommend, as well as some of the other more fanciful options that might be out there to really get the best video quality out of the Saturn on a modern display. I mean, I think that one of the cool things, if you're able to get a CTR TV, I would highly recommend it. If you can get one from a yard sale or car boot sale or whatever, and not have to pay too much or have to try to lug it home and that be an issue. I think it's worth it because it's awesome to just play all of those light gun games, which don't really work on modern LCD or plasma or other HD
No.
TVs. And the Saturn had some really awesome ones, like House of the Dead and Virtua Cop 1 and 2 and those types of games. Those are some of my favorite games for the console. So I really try to make a point to keep a CTR TV on hand just for that alone. So, Sam, what do you usually do for hooking up your Saturn to an HD TV?
Well, one thing I'm going to say before I even start talking is everybody needs to put down their pitchforks and understand that everybody has their own personal opinion, everybody has their own personal preferences. So I don't want any CRT, PVM, BVM, FrameMeister, OCC flame war happening down in the comments section. Um,
It's a good
to
disclaimer.
each their own. Yeah, to each their own. Me personally, finding a BVM or a PVM that is a large enough size for me to use, and for those who aren't in the know, you're basically talking about your professional video monitors. These are devices that have RGB hookup straight into the system. What I mean by that is you can actually hook RGB straight into the TV natively. We're not talking about your SCART adapter or your JP21 adapter. We're talking about breaking it out into its individual components. So you have some of the best video picture quality, period. Hands down, commercial CRTs do not even compete. This is the truth. Most of the time, you're not going to find those TVs anything bigger than, like, I think the largest one I've ever seen in person was about 20 inches.
Oh wow.
And that thing was massive and it was huge and it weighed twice as much as my 20-inch
Yeah.
Toshiba CRT.
Well, aren't they
Um,
really? Isn't the tube in them really elongated too? So it's kind of a unique looking display from what I can remember.
I, I'm I'm not by any means a TV repairman,
Yeah.
so I'm not even going to try to go into the technical aspects of that. What I do know is what they can do. I
Yeah.
know what they can visually do, and they can the amount of control and input you have on them, it blows everything else out of the water. Now, one thing is besides the bulkiness, besides the fact that these things are aging and eventually they will die, you just have the simple fact that a lot of people don't have ease of access to them and they don't want them anymore. Um, Regardless of how hardcore the retro gaming community is with using these things, at the end of the day, it's a lot easier to go down to the store and buy a 40-inch 1080p TV than it is to try to go hunt one of these down or hunt somebody down who can fix it. Not to mention, disclaimer, don't go breaking into a cathode ray tube TV. There are things up in there that will kill you. So if you do not have the knowledge to work on one, and I mean absolute certainty, do not break it open. Um, Besides that though, what I personally do is I have a 20-inch Toshiba CRT flat screen that I've had since 2001. It is my go-to CRT TV. It is aging. There are a number of issues with it, and I have yet to find somebody who wants to fix it, and I have yet myself to want to fix it. Now, granted, I can still play on it, but about the top tenth of the screen, or the top point 0.10, whoever's listening to this, you should understand tenth. The top tenth of the screen has a lot of issues with visual distortion. Like I said, I'm not an engineer on these things. I have a general idea of what's going on with it, but it still works. It still does light gun games right, and I love it. However, a number of years ago, I looked into going to the flat screen route, HD TV. Um, Now, granted, whenever you plug composite in, it looks like absolute crap. To me, it does. Not to mention, whenever you put it in widescreen, it looks like absolute crap. So what about S-Video? Well, most TVs after about 2008 didn't even support S-Video anymore. So that was completely out of the realm of reason. VGA was still good to go. Dreamcast, still great. If you plan on a Dreamcast, get something from the Baharo brothers. Just pay the money. It's good quality crap. But this isn't a Dreamcast channel. So whenever it comes to the Sega Saturn, and this is probably where the flame war is going to start. If you do not want perfect pixels or as close to perfect, in my opinion, if you don't want that perfect pixel look, then go with the OSSC, open source scanline converter. It doubles, triples the image. I had one and I no longer have one. The reason being is that to me, the image looks distorted. To me, the picture quality, at least in the form of luminosity, seems extremely too bright. It looks like I'm staring at the sun. I don't like that. Also, it just seems I can never get an audio system to work properly. The first OSSCs didn't have good way to get audio from RGB out. It didn't, I mean, for me, it didn't work right. For one, my TV didn't have the ability to plug in a 3.5 millimeter audio straight into an HDMI port. I didn't have one next to an HDMI port. I couldn't do it. So for me, that was completely shot. However, the FrameMeister, XRGB Mini FrameMeister from Iconsoft, even though it's pretty much discontinued at this point, I think there are still some pre-orders going around. That one right there, it costs a lot of money. But to me, that's the best route to go. For me, that's the best route to go. For my setup with 9, 10 retro consoles, it's the best way to go. For especially since I'm in the United States where RGB was never natively supported on our TVs. You and me both know this, Brian. The best we had was component, and that wasn't until like the late 90s. And that is basically a format of RGB to an extent. But for me, and this is kind of getting technical, for me, the best setup has been the FrameMeister. Again, what people need to do is they need to look at their setup and look at what they want and do the research and invest your money wisely. I always tell people, do research, do research, do research, because once you have paid that money, it is done. If it isn't something broken with it, you're not getting your money back unless you do like me and you sell it to somebody else. So do your research, see what you actually want. Hell, just try it out. Plug. I know it's a cardinal sin to say this, but take your your composite cable, plug it into your big old 48-inch, 50-inch, however big TV you got, and see how crap the picture looks. And if you're okay with it, roll on. If you want the best picture possible, then
Yeah.
come holler at us and we can talk to you.
So, yeah, I think that's great advice. And I mean, one of these days, I'm going to just bite the bullet and go for a FrameMeister. I mean, I think that has to be the next step. But I do want to like take a step back and dumb this down a bit. Leave it to me to dumb anything down pretty much. But I kind
Hey
of,
man, somebody's got to do it.
yeah. I mean, I also want to talk a little bit about what I've been doing, which is kind of the stopgap option. And you're right. It really sucks being in the U.S. or the North America and not really having SCART as a native input in any of our displays here, or at least mainstream ones. So that has sucked. But for what I've done, and this is a really relatively cheap route. Since the FrameMeister and even OSSCs, I mean, those are a couple $100 or a few $100 at least, right?
About $200 right now.
Yeah.
Which if you actually like that, roll with it, baby.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think if you're, kind of in my boat where you just wanted something that looks uh, at least a huge step up from composite or S video, but still isn't perfect or on the level of OSSC or FrameMeister. I mean, this is kind of the middle of the road option. But honestly, I mean, for about 40-50 bucks, you can get. And this is what I've done. I just have a RGB SCART cable, a pretty good quality one, along with a HDMI adapter for my plasma TV, and that has worked wonders. I mean, it still looks like, for my purposes and my standards, whatever they may be, it's actually a pretty crisp image, and I was very surprised once I got that hookup working. And it's not any HDMI adapter. I mean, some of them like do a little better job with a little, scaling than others. But the one that I have right now, I don't know if I should. I guess I could post a link to it to Amazon or whatever in the comments or however we're doing this. But for less than 40-50 bucks, it's been a fantastic option for me. So I've been pretty happy with that RGB SCART and HDMI converter.
And that's one thing to understand for people is that you have converters and you have upscalers. Converters, this is getting down to the technical aspect of it. Whenever it comes to the Sega Saturn, like many consoles in that generation, you were still dealing with 240p and 480i. Though that's pretty much that was it. And 480i is nothing more than an abomination. I mean, excuse me, 240p is nothing more than an abomination of 480i. It's just an exploit that people use. Native TVs in NTSC countries use 480i as standard definition television. Gaming corporations and developers figured out that they could do this little trick and make it into 240p. So that's really all you're going to get out of it. So whenever you have a converter that's taking an RGB signal and converting it over to HDMI or component or whatever the case might be, it's not upscaling it. What it's doing is it's just doing a simple pass through. It's changing how it gets there. It's like an extension cord that's got an extra prong on it that you don't need. It's there, but you don't need it. And in, one thing to understand about that, however, is that a lot of modern displays have a really hard time displaying 240p. A lot of them actually have a hard time understanding 480i because it's been discontinued. I mean, at least here in America, we don't even support standard definition TV anymore. Everything's gone to high definition. So a lot of TVs do not even understand what they have inside of every computer. There's an upscaler, and this is where your lag comes in whenever you're just plugging straight into the TV. Um, Whenever the picture is not a proper high definition format, what happens is that the TV itself has to go, hold up, whoa, this is not cool. All right, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna stretch this thing, I'm gonna stretch that a little bit this way. Okay, we're gonna just like throw it down. It looks like shit, but guess what? It's the right format, and that's what your TV does. And it takes 10, 15 frames. I'm exaggerating here, but it takes time for the TV to do that. So whenever you're using a straight converter like Brian's doing, you have to understand you're going to have lag introduced. The very same way as the FrameMeister has lag. It has very much significantly less lag because the actual FrameMeister is doing all the processing for you. So whenever it gets to your TV really doesn't have to do anything. Me, myself, I get about 4 or 5 seconds of lag on one of my
Oh,
screens. I mean, 4 or
wow.
5
Oh,
frames.
frames. I was
Excuse me,
gonna
4 or 5
say, holy shit.
frames. Yeah, no, not 4 or 5 seconds. God, no. 4 or 5 frames. And here in America, you're talking about, 60 frames a second. So I've got, 4 or 5 frames on one TV, and my other TV, I get like 3 frames. Not even that. It's like
Yeah.
2.5 frames. So, your mileage may vary. Whereas you've got some converters that just go straight up 6, 7 frames a second, which is actually pretty noticeable for most people. And then you get to things like your OSSC, which have virtually there's actually no lag sometimes. I mean, it's just straight pass through. And
Nice.
that's one of the only benefits. I mean, I'm not going to say the only benefit, but it's a very big leg up that the OSSC has over the FrameMeister, at least if you're in like the group of people who want to play, platformers that are very precise or shoot 'em up, stuff like that.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I think this is a lot more detail than I expected we go into on this, but I think it's super important to kind of weigh the pros and cons of each of these setups at each price point. And certainly OSSC seems like it has a lot going for it. Well, yeah, I was just saying, going back to the leg issue. I mean, that's certainly a downfall. Really, anytime you're routing anything through a converter, let alone multiple converters. So, in my experience with the ones that I've had, I had to go through like two or three before I got one that I felt was good enough. And even then, you're going to get a few frames of lag out of it. Mine's probably a little more just because I have it hooked up to a Panasonic Plasma, which in itself introduces a little more lag over like a just most LCD TVs. But I'm also not a fighting game aficionado, so those extra frames, for me in most of the games I play and how much I generally suck at them, doesn't really isn't really going to make much of a difference in my mind. But I still think there are some affordable options that are, depending on what your tastes are, also pretty relatively acceptable in that leg department as well.
Right, and if we're going to talk about, all these different ways of looking at screens, actually getting the best resolution, et cetera, we need to start talking about the peripherals because
Yes,
it doesn't matter what your picture looks like if you're playing with an
yes,
actual
yes.
crap controller in your hands. I mean, whatever
So
it all
so
boils down
what's
to, and
so I take it you're not a bulky what is that, the Mark One fan?
we call it a Mark One, but the truth be told, it isn't a Mark One.
It's not not
Hold on
only in
just
North
two
America, really.
seconds. Yeah, only in North America was it a Mark One. If you'll give me 2 seconds, I could just jump out and throw down some knowledge on you real fast.
Yeah, go for it.
Um, let's see. The one you're talking about is the model 88 is the model 80,100. The 80,100 model was the Mark One
Yeah.
per se, and that's the big bulky the big bulky one that everybody likes to give so much credit, well, bad talk to. But at the end of the day, what we ended up getting here in the States, at least, the Mark II as we call it, that was the 80,116. And that is the original controller, the original gamepad that shipped with the Sega Saturn in Japan. So if we're going to talk about the bulky, the Duke of the Sega Saturn versus the slimline version, for me it wasn't that bad a deal because I mean, hell, I never even got my hands on a Mark II, controller until I want to say 99,
Yeah.
2000 almost. I was playing the Dreamcast by the time I finally got my hands on one. And yes, it felt tremendously better, but it also felt really weird because I'd used that big controller for years and got accustomed to it.
Yeah. No, I'm in a similar, well, not a similar boat, just because I was a relative latecomer to the system and I got one of each pretty early on. But honestly, I mean, for my purposes, I will say objectively, the slimmer controller is better in almost every way. I think the button quality is a bit better. The D-pad's way better. Um, but one thing I will say about the bulky one, and that's the one I probably use the most often, mainly in my situation, my wrist started having some like carpal tunnel issues in the last year or so. So having a bulkier pad that really settles into the palms, like that original North American one did, actually is really more comfortable for me. Even though the D-pad's a little more, it's a little more frail and finicky. And the buttons, I think, aren't quite as they don't really hold position quite as solidly as the Mark II. But I honestly I like both controllers. I really do.
Now, I think I'm going to pull out some heresy right here. For me personally, whenever it comes to fighting games, I want the 3D controller. I want the UFO in my hands.
Yeah,
I don't care what anybody
the
says.
analog stick.
Dude, the analog controller is bad ass whenever it comes to fighting games, in my opinion.
Hmm.
It's just something about that layout. It's so now a lot of people absolutely hate the Sega Dreamcast controller. I'm kind of partial to it, but myself, that UFO controller is just where the button placement is, the triggers, everything else, the D-pad, it's a beautiful controller. Not to mention if you want to play a 3D game
Hmm.
or you want to play a 3D enabled controller game, you're going to have to use it. I mean, and there's a large number of titles that actually support it.
Yeah, yeah, I love that controller as well. I mean, aside from being an absolute necessity for certain games like Knights, where you need to have a continuous 360 rolling motion with the 3D analog pad or the stick. Um, I like it for a lot of racing games as well, particularly when you can. I think Daytona USA, at least the Japanese Circuit Edition one, and some of the others let you map the accelerator and brake to the trigger buttons. And the trigger buttons are
Right.
by far and away the best improvement beyond the analog stick, in my opinion, over the original controllers. And it was in many ways, as you were alluding, a precursor to what the Dreamcast and how that would generally handle its layout as well as its trigger functionality. And I think it was a huge step forward for a lot of those games for sure.
Yeah, and we also have you have what is it? Was there two wheels released? There
Hmm.
was a steering wheel released. There were multiple fighting sticks released. There was also the ASCII pad. I mean, there was a number of high quality controllers and interfaces that were produced for the Saturn. A lot of them exclusively to Japan. I mean, there's actually, a way to control a train. That's the one game that you can play on it, but there's actually a controller for a train.
Yeah, I just bought that. I had actually had some
Oh my
yeah,
God.
no, I had some friends over last weekend, and none of we'll play the occasional like Samba de Amigo or um, some of the PSVR games and stuff, and they like Bomberman as well. But yeah, we were busting this out, and none of us could really figure out how it worked. But it seems like a relatively simple game, and the control pad is really crazy because it has like just like two levers. One of them you're using for the accelerator, and it has like different positions you want to gradually get it into. I think I don't know if they're gears or whatever it is. And then the other one is going to be your brake, and so it'll like pop up with all of these warning messages as you're going down the track if you accidentally move the brake while you still have the accelerator full throttle, or if it's too early. And it's like, I don't know, for us it was pretty confusing, but we had a ton of fun just because you're messing around,
Hell
and
yeah, man.
passengers are falling over or getting pissed that you missed their stop. And yeah, it's that's I don't know, I just love the quirkiness of that kind of stuff. And I think what Densha They Go, that's the name of the game. um, but yeah.
That's Japan for you right there, man.
um, and also, I think we got to talk about the stunner light gun, shouldn't we? Yeah. I mean, so this week, I don't know if I mentioned it earlier, but I broke my leg a bit, or a while back. And so, I've been kind of just hanging out next to my CRT TV the whole time. And I've put in some pretty good quality time with Virtua Cop 2 and House of the Dead. And I don't know, it's just an awesome old school light gun. Like you can tell that compared to the PlayStation Move or the Vive, or sorry, the Oculus controllers, or any of the new fangled motion sensors, any of the Wii stuff. Like even compared to that, it is incredibly primitive. I mean, you basically just have the tube read the position of the beam where you click the trigger, and that's about it. Whether it's on screen or off screen, and it's like I don't know how accurate it is compared to some of those newer technologies, but for those types of games and those arcade ports where you're just shooting up, terrorists and zombies and stuff, I don't know, it's just such a fun, gratifying piece of hardware. I love that the Saturn kind of embraced those types of games, and I guess back then that was still a pretty common genre to see. I mean, you have the Time Crisis games on the PlayStation. I don't know if the 64 ever had much of that, but man, yeah, that's a awesome. If you have a CRT TV and you get a Saturn, I mean, I highly recommend picking up a Stunner light gun. Those are like the orange plasticky. It just looks like a toy, but it's so much fun.
Yeah, and one thing we kind of jumped over it, but the one thing too everybody needs to understand, if you've been with the Saturn for a while, you already know about it because eventually, and if you buy a brand new Saturn, you're going to know about it pretty quickly. Whenever you crank that bad boy up, it's going to ask you what date it is, just like the Sega Dreamcast does
Oh
every
yeah.
single time. Guess what, boys and girls? At least you're safe from having to solder things because Sega, for once, they did something really good, and that was they made it to where you can just go grab a CR 2032 battery,
Yeah.
and you can just pop that little back off, throw it down, and guess what? Not only will that clock chill out and not do any more crazy stuff, you can set it up right, everything's good to go, but you also have about 1,000 blocks of memory.
Yep.
So that was amazing. Think about it. That was the only console of that generation that allowed for direct save to the console. The PlayStation didn't do it. The N64 didn't save directly to the console. If it did have a save function built in, it was built onto the cartridge. But yeah, Generally speaking, a good introduction to the Sega Saturn. I mean, we've covered everything from games, import quality, how to play imports, how to actually get some good quality picture out of your system, how to save your games if you don't want to invest in a memory card, or a memory cart, I should say. And also, we talked a lot about how you can actually interact with the system whenever it comes to the peripherals and everything. One thing I would like to say is we appreciate everybody who took their time and actually listened to the last podcast, and we appreciate everybody who's coming to the junkyard, showing their love, not only for the Sega Saturn but also for the community that's built up. Again, we couldn't do this if y'all weren't here. I mean, yeah, we could sit here and talk about all this stuff and have a grand old time and laugh at each other and everything, but at the end of the day, we do this because people like to listen to us. You know, y'all are our audience and we want to talk to y'all. We want to talk about what y'all want to hear about. So if you ever have any recommendations or any ideas or topics on, what we could actually discuss, drop it in the comments, whether it be on Facebook or whether it be on YouTube. Believe me, we do read them. We do look at them. Uh, Brian, you got anything?
No, but I mean, just to echo kind of what you were saying, I'm really appreciative that this community is kind of flourished into what it is, and the people on here. I mean, you guys are awesome. Like whether or not you're listening to the podcast, I mean, just the Facebook community in itself is just a really fun place to go and check and see what new topics have come up and what other just crazy antics people have gotten into. So and I think it really helps to have like that uh, a member base and everybody out there that's just so engaged and so passionate about the Saturn and so willing to share their experiences and ideas and everything about it. So and just learn from each other. And I'm really grateful to have that whole community as a resource for just getting more out of the console.
So again, from all of us here at the junkyard, thanks for stopping by. This is us signing off.